Tonight, the world will forget you ever existed, unless you can learn the one forbidden harmony before the final echo dies. Yeah, that's what I woke up to. No greeting, no warning, just that sentence echoing inside my skull like a cracked bell. I sat up in the narrow cot of my caravan, salt crust flaking from my hair like snow that had forgotten how to melt. The air tasted of copper and old brine, and every breath felt borrowed. My fingers reached for the small hand mirror beside the lantern, the one I used to check if I still looked like myself after weeks alone on the flats. No reflection stared back. Not a shadow, not a blur. Just the empty glass, silvered and slick, as if I'd never been born. As if I'd already been erased. I spun toward the larger mirror by the door. Same void. My heartbeat drummed louder than the wind outside, and I swear the glass shivered like it wanted to apologize. That's when the lantern guttered, and the caravan tilted, though no wheel had moved. Something outside was shifting weight, and it wasn't sand. I shoved the door open. The Hollowglass flat stretched out under a swollen, blood-red moon, the surface polished to obsidian, reflecting nothing but the sky's own wound. Every step I'd taken for 3 years should have left prints, yet the black glass lay flawless, as if the world had ironed itself smooth the moment I blinked. Far off, a low note trembled, so deep my teeth ached. It wasn't wind, it was voice, one note held for centuries, fraying at the edges. A single moth brushed my cheek, cold as winter breath. It landed on my wrist, wings beating with a soft electric hum. The patterns on those wings weren't random. They were maps, rivers, coastlines, mountains, etched in pulsing violet light. The moth flexed, and the map moved like living ink, curling toward the center where a tiny star blinked and dimmed. I'd spent my life charting places no one remembered, and now a bug was giving me directions. The star on the wings sputtered, and pain lanced through my palm, as if the dying star bit me. A single word formed in my mind, not spoken, but sung. Remember. Remember what? I staggered back inside, clutching the moth like it might fly off with the last proof I existed. My charts hung from the rafters, edges curling, ink fading even as I watched. I pulled down the oldest scroll, Hollowglass, year 900, and the parchment cracked like dry leaves. The final staff was incomplete, only 4 notes drawn, the 5th a smear of ash. I'd always assumed the choir was legend, a caution tale cartographers told to scare apprentices, but the parchment trembled in my hands, resonating with the distant bass note still rolling across the flats. The moth lifted, circled the lantern once, and landed on the scroll. Its wings overlaid the missing measure, completing the melody in violet fire. The soundless harmony filled my head, beautiful, impossible, and absolutely forbidden. My tongue tasted iron again, and I realized it was the taste of forgetting. The edges of the caravan blurred, and for a heartbeat, I couldn't recall my own name. I slammed the scroll shut. The moth darted to the door, frantic now, beating against the wood like a warning bell. I followed, boots crunching salt. Outside, the glass desert had begun to sing back, not echo, but answer. The choir's 900-year note swelled, and hairline cracks spidered across the flats, each fracture glowing the same violet as the moth's wings. The cracks spelled my name in reverse, letters dissolving as soon as I read them. I pressed my palm to the nearest fracture. The glass was warm, thrumming with heartbeat. The harmony the moth had shown me echoed up my arm, lodging behind my eyes like a splinter of song. I knew, with the certainty of a map that will not lie, that if I sang even one wrong interval, the choir would claim the final echo and I would become a silence no one noticed. The moth spiraled upward, wings flickering faster, the star at their center now a pinprick. It darted toward the horizon, where the choir's note grew deafening. I had until that star went dark, minutes, maybe less, to master a music older than language, or vanish mid-breath. I took one step onto the singing glass. It held. Next step, the cracks will test my pitch. Behind me, the caravan creaked, and I swear I heard the mirrors inside shatter, erasing the last place my reflection might have hidden. The choir inhaled, preparing the final cadence. My voice, untested and terrified, hovered at the edge of the forbidden note. And that's when the moth burst into violet flame, spelling out a single instruction in the air. Follow. The second step landed lighter than I expected, yet the glass beneath me rang like a struck bell. The note I had feared, an unsound that could flay the soul, never arrived. Instead, the moth, still burning violet, hovered inches from my nose, wings fanning a perfume of burnt lavender and winter iron. I followed, because that single word hung in the air like a hook, and I was already caught. We moved through corridors of echoing light, the choir's presence shrinking behind me until it became a single, far-off heartbeat. Funny thing, every footfall erased another echo, as though the space itself was forgetting how to be space. The moth banked left, and the world folded. I mean that literally. The hallway bent 90 degrees upward, then creased like paper, until floor became ceiling, and ceiling became the sky of some other night. My stomach lurched, but I kept walking, because the alternative was falling upward into a starless dark. The moth landed on my wrist, delicate legs pricking skin that had already begun to feel borrowed. When its wings opened, the silver veins I had seen in the air now threaded across its scales, forming a map that hurt to read. Not a map of land, but of loss. Each line pulsed, and with every pulse, something inside me thinned. A treehouse I had built at 9, gone. The nails, the rope ladder, the way the wind smelled like pine and mischief, gone. I felt the absence like a tooth yanked without warning. I tried to memorize faster than the moth could erase. My mother's lullaby. Hush now, hush. The stars are only sheep. Slipped away between heartbeats. The color of my father's eyes, once the warm brown of river stones after rain, faded to gray, then to nothing. I staggered. The corridor widened into a circular chamber, where every wall was a mirror, reflecting not my face, but places I no longer recognized. A swing set rusting in an empty yard, a birthday cake with no candles, a girl waving goodbye to someone she used to be. The moth flared brighter, impatient. Its wings beat once, and the mirrors cracked along their phantom memories. Silver fluid, liquid cartography, spilled out, pooling at my feet. It rose like tide, licking my ankles with frostbite heat. I understood then. The journey wasn't across distance. It was across time I had already lived. Every memory the moth consumed became a stepping stone, and I was running out of stones. I snatched the moth mid-flight, trapping it inside the only thing I had left, an empty glass vial that once held headache tonic. The irony tasted metallic. The creature slammed against the glass, violet fire dimming to sullen ember. Silence. For one heartbeat, two. I thought I had won. Then the map began to etch itself into my flesh. Not onto, into. Veins of molten silver burrowed under my skin, following the same impossible geometry the moth had shown. I watched, horrified and mesmerized, as my forearm became parchment. The pain was exquisite, like writing with ice on a burn that refused to heal. Each new line was a street I had never walked, a door I had never opened, yet somehow they felt familiar, as if déjà vu had learned to use a scalpel. The vial grew cold in my grip. Inside, the moth folded its wings, not in defeat, but in contemplation. Whisper, it was never guiding me. It was only the quill. The choir, somewhere far behind, exhaled a chord that rattled the glass and made my bones hum like tuning forks. The map on my arm twitched toward that sound, a compass needle made of scar tissue. I pressed my thumb over the newest line, a fork where the road split between a memory of my first kiss and the scent of my grandmother's kitchen. The silver hesitated, then chose. The kiss dissolved. I tasted cinnamon and wood smoke for an instant, before even that vanished. The path ahead solidified, a bridge of absence spanning an abyss of everything I'd forgotten. The chamber tilted. Gravity became negotiable. I floated, vial clenched, arm burning, toward an archway that hadn't existed seconds earlier. Beyond it, darkness rippled like cloth and underwater wind. Somewhere inside that dark, something sang back, not the choir, but a voice older, lonelier, shaped like the hollow left when a memory dies. I hovered at the threshold. The map on my arm pulsed once, twice, then spelled out a word I hadn't lost yet. Choose. Behind me, The corridor folded itself into a neat square and slipped into nothing, sealing the return path like a letter never meant to be mailed. Ahead, the dark waited, patient as a held breath. I raised the vial. The moth looked back at me with compound eyes that held every color I had already forgotten. I could crush it, shatter the glass, end this pilgrimage of erasure. Or I could uncork it, let the quill finish its story in my blood. The choir struck a note so low, it turned my heartbeat arrhythmic. Time coughed. The dark rippled closer, and in its folds, I saw the outline of a door that opened onto the moment I was born. The vial warmed. No, burned. The moth beat its wings once, and the glass began to sing. It wants out. It wants the rest. I pressed the cork between my teeth, tasting salt and starlight. Behind the door, something waited that knew my name before my mother ever spoke it. The map on my arm throbbed, eager to finish its route through the country of who I used to be. I drew a breath I might never remember taking. And that's when the vial cracked, a hairline fracture racing from base to lip like a prophecy too late to stop. The vial's fracture hissed like a snake tasting air. I felt the moth inside press its wings against the glass, not frantically, but with the patience of something that has already waited centuries. Then, snap, the cork dissolved between my teeth, not crumbling, simply ceasing to be. Salt dusted my tongue, starlight burned behind my eyes. And the moth poured out like liquid moonlight, spilling across my palm before dissolving into the map tattooed on my wrist. The map flared, lines shifted, and suddenly I was walking, though I never remembered deciding to move. The obsidian salt flats stretched before me like a frozen ocean, each grain a tiny black mirror, reflecting a sky that wasn't quite the color of any sky I'd ever seen. My first step crunched down, and I felt the salt give beneath my weight, not breaking, but remembering. When I lifted my foot, there it was, a perfect fossil of my boot's tread, already hardening into black glass. I'd only taken one step, and already my past was chasing me. The second step made my teeth ache, not from the impact, from the sound, or rather, the almost sound. A note so low it lived in my bones rather than my ears, vibrating through my ribs like a second heartbeat. The choir. They were tuning up for something that had started before time began and would continue long after it ended. I knew that now. The map on my arm pulsed with each subsonic vibration, drawing me forward across the flats like a compass that only pointed to the end of everything. Every footstep behind me became a fossilized future. I could see them stretching back toward a horizon that didn't exist when I'd started walking. 20 steps, 30, 50, and there, in the distance, my own footprints continued without me. I hadn't walked that far. I was sure of it. But there they were, my boots pressed into salt that remembered me walking alone for miles I hadn't yet traveled. The path knew where I was going better than I did. That's when I saw the sculptor. He sat cross-legged in the salt, hands moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd been carving the same material for longer than most civilizations lasted. His eyes were milk-white, clouded over like old glass, but his fingers knew their work. Before him stood statues, dozens of them, carved from the same black salt that remembered my footsteps. "You're late," he said without looking up. His voice cracked like ice breaking. 117 years late, but then they always are. I stopped walking. My next footstep didn't fossilize. The salt had stopped remembering me. "The last performance," I whispered, though I didn't know why I knew to say it. "You were there." His laugh was the sound of wind through empty cathedrals. Everyone was there, until they weren't, until they never had been. He gestured to the statues with hands that left no prints in the salt. These are the ones who listened too well, who heard the note that unmade them. The choir doesn't perform for audiences. They consume them, one perfect note at a time. I walked closer, my feet crunching through centuries of fossilized screams. The statues were exquisite, terrifying, each one caught in a moment of impossible beauty and absolute terror. A woman reaching towards something she could never quite grasp. A man mid-transformation, his mouth open in a song that had no sound. And then, There, at the back, a statue that made my heart stop beating for one impossible moment. It was me, older, lines etched around eyes that had seen too much, mouth open in a silent scream that looked almost like singing. The sculptor had captured the exact moment when recognition becomes horror, when understanding becomes undoing. My future self, already carved in salt that remembered a performance I hadn't yet attended. When? I started, but the sculptor held up one weathered hand. Time's a circle here, girl. The salt remembers forward as well as back. That statue's been waiting for you since the last performance ended. It always finishes before it begins. The question is, and here he finally turned those milk-white eyes toward me, are you going to step into your own footprints or carve new ones? The choir's note deepened, vibrating through the statues until they hummed like tuning forks. My older self's stone mouth opened wider, as if trying to warn me of something that had already happened. The map on my arm burned like frostbite. Behind me, the fossilized footsteps I'd left began to shift, rearranging themselves into a pattern I almost recognized. The sculptor smiled, and it was the saddest expression I'd ever seen carved into living stone. Choose quickly. The salt's almost done remembering, and when it forgets... He gestured to the empty spaces between statues, places where more figures should have stood. Well, there's always room for one more in the choir. The moth tattoo pulsed once, twice, then began to sing. The salt song faded behind me, like a lullaby dying in its crib. I ran, not away, but downward, following the spiral that had etched itself deeper into my skin with every heartbeat. The map burned colder now, a brand of frost that whispered directions in a language made of shivers. Down, always down, until my feet found purchase not on earth, but on air itself. The mine shaft yawned open beneath me like a throat that had forgotten how to swallow. No ladder, no stairs, just darkness coiling upward, breathing out the scent of ancient stone, and something else, something that tasted like regret and sounded like singing. Not the choir, not yet. This was older, raw, the kind of song that existed before mouths learned to shape words. My hands found the walls, and the walls found my memories. Smooth obsidian, warm as skin, pulsing with the rhythm of 1,000 heartbeats that weren't mine. Each step down sent echoes bouncing upward. Not sound exactly, but the ghost of sound, like audio trying to remember what it used to be. The moth on my wrist fluttered in circles, its wings beating out a pattern that matched the pulse in the stone. Careful, little singer, a voice drifted up from below. Not the sculptor's voice. This one was made of wind and dust and the spaces between words. The echo mine doesn't give back what it takes. But I was already too far down to stop. The spiral pressed against my bones, urging me deeper into the throat of the world. That's when I saw them, and foray lining the walls like books in a library of lost things. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Each one labeled in script that hurt to read. Letters that squirmed away from comprehension. I touched one at random. The clay was warm, vibrating with contained sound. The label read, Martha Crane, last laugh before the fire. Another, Elias Moore, first lie to his mother. Names and moments, bottled and shelved like preserves. My fingers traced the spiral downward, past jars labeled with emotions I didn't have words for, sounds that had never been meant for human ears. Then I found it. Third shelf from the bottom, nestled between the scream that became a mountain and silence that learned to sing. A small amphora, no bigger than my fist, stoppered with black wax. The label was written in my mother's handwriting. Ilara Vale, first breath. My hands shook as I lifted it. The clay felt familiar, like holding my own heartbeat. Around me, the mind's song shifted key, recognizing something it hadn't expected. The other jars began to hum in harmony, a choir of stolen moments building toward the crescendo that would unravel everything. I absolutely should not have, but the spiral on my arm burned with frost fire, and the moth sang instructions I couldn't ignore. My thumbnail cracked the wax seal. The cork came free with a sound like breaking bones. What came out wasn't air. It was me, 9 pounds, 7 ounces of pure possibility, screaming my way into a world that would spend the next 23 years trying to figure out what to do with me. My newborn cry echoed off the obsidian walls, multiplying, fracturing, becoming something more than memory. It was a tuning fork struck against the spine of reality, and the mine responded like a struck bell. The walls cracked, not stone. Sound itself cracked, fissures opening in the air itself. Echoes poured out of their jars like bats fleeing a burning cave, swirling around me in a tornado of stolen voices. I heard my mother's laugh, my father's last words, the sound of rain on a roof I'd never seen. All the moments they'd taken, all the sounds they'd harvested, rushing back to where they belonged. But the spiral on my arm had other plans. It pulled me down, down, past the shelves and the jars and the last remnants of my first breath. The newborn cry became a note, became a chord, became the beginning of a song that had been building for 900 years. I was falling now, amphora clutched to my chest like a life preserver made of memory. The choir's voice rose up to meet me, not from below, but from everywhere at once. Not a song anymore, but a conversation. The echo mine wasn't just harvesting sounds, it was teaching them to sing back. And I, Elara Vale, was about to become the final note in a composition that would unmake the world. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was my own voice, aged 900 years, whispering from somewhere far below. Welcome home, composer. We've been waiting for you to remember how this ends. And then, nothing. Just the sound of falling. I fell for what felt like years, tumbling through velvet darkness that tasted of copper and forgotten lullabies. My stomach tried to climb into my throat, but there was no up or down, just the endless spiral of descent. The choir's last words echoed around me like moths with broken wings. Welcome home, composer. Those 3 words carried the weight of centuries, and suddenly I wasn't falling anymore. I was floating. The darkness peeled back like theater curtains, revealing a sight that stole what little breath I had left. A river, no, something far more impossible, flowed upward through a cavern so vast it could swallow cathedrals whole. Liquid starlight, actual starlight, poured from the cavern floor toward the ceiling in defiance of every law I'd ever known. And the fish, oh, the fish! They swam against this impossible current, but they weren't fish at all. They were constellations given form, swimming shapes of Orion and Cassiopeia and Draco, their star bodies trailing silver fire as they fought their way upstream. My left arm burned with cold fire. I looked down and the moth map had spread. What started as delicate wing bones across my wrist had become a living sleeve of liquid mercury, shifting and flowing like the river itself. The map lines weren't just showing me places anymore. They were showing me when places existed. I saw the echo mine as it would be 900 years from now, empty and singing. I saw the salt flats remembering footsteps that wouldn't be made for centuries. Time was just another direction here, and I was falling through all of them at once. Payment, a voice said, though I couldn't tell you where it came from. The word felt like frost on my spine. A boat approached, not floated, not sailed, but approached through the very concept of arrival. It was made of bone, but not any bone I'd ever known. These were the bones of songs, the calcium white remains of melodies that had died and fossilized. And pulling it, the ferryman had no face. Where features should have been, there was only smooth skin stretched over hollow architecture, like a mask waiting for someone to wear it. He extended one hand, not a hand, really, but the suggestion of one, and spoke without moving his mouth. Payment for passage, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere. A memory you have not yet lived. My throat felt suddenly dry. I don't have any memories I haven't lived. Everyone does, the faceless face seemed to smile. The memory of your death, the memory of how this ends, the memory of who you become when the song finishes playing. I reached for something, anything, to give him. My pockets held only the echo of pockets, but then I understood. The choir had been preparing me for this moment since I first heard their song bleeding through the walls of my childhood bedroom. Every note was a breadcrumb, every harmony was a map. I offer, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, the memory of my death, The one that hasn't happened yet. The one where I drown in silver fire while the choir sings the world into silence. The ferryman tilted his smooth head. Then, with the sound of 1,000 lullabies ending at once, he nodded. The river changed, the starlight became silver fire, and I saw myself, not a reflection, but a memory that existed in the future tense. There I was, floating in that same impossible river, but this time I was the one drowning. My hair spread around me like spilled ink, my mouth opened in a scream that became the final note of the choir's 900-year composition. The silver fire poured into my lungs, but instead of burning, it sang. It sang with my voice. It sang with the voice of every Alara who had ever existed across all the fractured timelines. Passage granted, the ferryman said, and his voice sounded almost sad, almost human. The bone boat scraped against a shore that wasn't there a moment ago. I stepped onto it, my mercury sleeve map glowing brighter now, showing me paths that twisted through probability and regret. The constellation fish swirled around my ankles, their star bodies whispering secrets about the moment when everything ends. But as I walked forward, if forward was even the right word anymore, I heard something that made my blood crystallize in my veins. The choir wasn't just singing anymore. They were harmonizing with my voice, the voice from my future death, the one I'd just given away as payment, was joining their song. And at the exact moment my future self screamed her final note, the present tense me heard her whisper from somewhere impossibly close. The river flows upward, composer, because that's the direction time runs when you're falling toward the beginning. But here's the part I haven't told you yet. Her voice cut off, swallowed by the sound of cathedral walls beginning to breathe. The river spat me out like a bad memory. One moment I was drowning in liquid midnight, the next I was sliding across polished obsidian that drank the sound of my landing. No splash, no echo, just the wet slap of my body against stone that felt warm as fevered skin. The choir's single note had followed me here, vibrating through the floor like a tuning fork pressed to bone. I rolled onto my back and stared up at impossible architecture. Shelves carved from the same black glass, stretched into darkness that might have been sky, might have been ceiling. Who could tell in a place where geometry forgot its own rules? Books bound in something that pulsed with shallow breathing lined every surface. The air tasted of copper pennies and unshed tears. A figure emerged from between the shelves. Tall, robed in what looked like shredded starlight, face obscured by hanging threads that might have been hair or might have been something far worse. When they turned toward me, I saw their mouth wasn't obscured at all. It was sewn shut with silver wire that glinted like captured moonlight, each stitch pulling the lips into a permanent, silent scream. The librarian's eyes held depths I couldn't fathom, like they were reading me backward from my own ending. They extended one pale hand, and I saw their fingernails were made of translucent crystal, each one containing a tiny storm. In their palm rested a book that made my stomach lurch sideways. The cover was my own face, or rather, what my face might look like if someone had rendered it in soft leather and stretched it thin enough to see light through. Across the front, in Boston letters that bled slowly like fresh wounds, read, Ilara, the unsung verse. The librarian pressed it into my hands with surprising gentleness. Their touch was cold as winter breath, and when our fingers brushed, I heard, no, felt, 1,000 screams that hadn't happened yet. The choir's single note grew louder, harmonizing with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell which was keeping which alive. I opened the book. The pages were blank at first, smooth as cream, warm as living flesh. Then the ink began to bloom across the surface like spilled wine, and I watched my childhood rewrite itself in real time. Except it wasn't my childhood anymore. The house on Willow Street where I'd grown up, gone. The garden where my mother used to sing while hanging laundry, replaced by an empty lot where weeds grew in perfect musical notation. My father's face, which I'd spent 27 years trying to forget, simply wasn't. Never had been. The pages showed my mother alone, humming tunelessly while staring at photographs that contained only her reflection. No, I whispered, but the book kept writing. My 5th birthday party became a funeral for a child who'd never existed. My mother's lullabies turned into wordless keening that hurt to hear. Every memory I'd clung to like driftwood in a storm was being overwritten by this terrible, beautiful script that wrote itself with my own unvoiced screams. I slammed the book shut. The changes remained. I could feel them settling into my mind like frost on glass. My mother's songs now just empty air. My father's absence not an ache, but a simple fact. The choir's note modulated, became almost triumphant, and I understood with sick clarity that this was their composition. They weren't just singing reality apart, they were conducting it, measure by measure, and I'd just watched them erase my first movement. The librarian tilted their head, those sewn-shut lips somehow conveying terrible sympathy. They reached for the book, but I clutched it to my chest like a shield. Something in their posture shifted. Urgency, maybe fear? Their crystal fingernails clicked against each other, creating a sound like breaking bells. That's when I heard it. Beneath the choir's perfect tone, another voice, struggling to emerge. My own voice, but wrong somehow. Younger. The voice of a child who'd never been born, singing a lullaby that had never existed. The book grew warm against my chest, pulsing like a second heart, and I realized with growing horror that the pages weren't finished writing. They were just getting started. And somewhere in the stacks, something was waking up. Something that had been waiting 900 years for this exact moment, when the song finally reached the part where I stopped existing altogether. The librarian's sewn lips parted just enough to let a single silver wire snap free, and what poured out wasn't a scream at all. It was my name, spoken in the voice of the woman I'd never become. The librarian's silver thread voice still echoed in my bones when the book began to melt. Not metaphorically, the leather cover liquefied like warm honey, dripping down my arms, pooling at my feet until it formed a perfect circle of ink-black water. And because the universe apparently had a sense of humor today, it started singing. The melody was the same one I'd been humming since Hollowglass, 9 centuries compressed into a single descending scale. Each note pulled at my chest like hooks, and before I could step back, the black pool swallowed me whole. Cold doesn't begin to describe it. This was the kind of cold that remembers your name. I fell sideways through the curtain of dripping sound, because of course I did, and landed in what could only be described as a dressing room designed by someone who'd only heard about rooms secondhand. The walls breathed, literally expanding and contracting like lungs, exhaling notes that tasted like regret and copper pennies. And there they were, 23 versions of myself, translucent as morning fog, wearing robes that looked like someone had poured liquid night over their shoulders and let it harden into silk. They stood in perfect rows, mouths open in silent song, practicing the same note until their lungs began to crystallize. I watched future me, snaring Mother 12, cough up a perfect shard of obsidian, caught it like a cough drop, and kept singing. The harmony was simple, too simple, one sustained tone that vibrated at the exact frequency of my bones breaking. And the longer they held it, the more solid they became, which should have been good, right? Except solid meant glass, and glass meant shatter. One figure stepped forward. Her throat was already translucent, the glass creeping up like frost on a window. She looked exactly like me if I'd made all the wrong choices, and then made them again for good measure. When she opened her mouth, her voice came out in pieces. "You're early," she said, and the words fell to the floor like broken bells. Or maybe I'm late. Time's funny when you're singing yourself to death. Nothing says welcome to your destiny like being handed your own skeleton. "Learn the counter harmony," she whispered, and I could see the glass reaching her teeth now, turning them into a smile that would never break. Or we all shatter. Every version, every possibility. The choir needs a descant, and you're it. The other Alaras turned as one, their mouths still open in that impossible note. I could see through their chest now, hearts beating in reverse, pumping liquid night instead of blood. One of them, younger than the rest, met my eyes and mouthed something I couldn't quite catch. Looked like run, or maybe ruin. Hard to tell when your lips are turning to glass. The tuning fork vibrated in my palm, warm as fresh guilt. When I held it up, the sound it made was my name backwards, sung in the key of regret. The walls responded immediately, rippling like disturbed water, and I realized the entire chamber was actually one enormous throat. We were standing in something's voice box, and it was getting ready to speak. Future me number one, or maybe last. Time was apparently optional here. Placed her hand on my shoulder. Her fingers were already crystallizing, leaving frost patterns on my jacket. The song's almost finished, she said. 900 years, and it comes down to this. One note held too long, or not long enough. The difference between existing and, well, you know. I tried to step back, but my feet had started making the same sound, that crystalline ring that meant I was joining the chorus, whether I wanted to or not. Future me leaned closer, her breath smelling like winter and forgotten birthdays. The librarian sent you here for a reason. The book didn't melt. It opened. This is what comes after the last page. This is where the story learns to sing. And that's when I noticed the silence. The note had stopped. 23 pairs of glass eyes stared at me, waiting. The tuning fork grew heavier, pulling my hand down like it wanted to conduct an orchestra of breaking things. Your turn, they said in perfect unison, voices harmonizing into something that sounded exactly like goodbye. The tuning fork tugged so hard my wrist cracked like a frozen branch. I let go, and it clanged to the marble floor, sending out a silver ripple that tasted of pennies and snow. The ripple raced across the dressing room and vanished into the spiral staircase beyond, the one the glass-eyed singers had been guarding. No one moved. 23 faces tilted in perfect mechanical unison, mouths still shaped around the last silent note. Then, together, they stepped backward, clearing a path. Down, the corridor breathed, though no lungs lived there. Down to the place that remembers the shape of music before it was sound. I should have run. Instead, I followed the tuning fork's dying ring like a breadcrumb made of shivering air. Each step I took stole the warmth from my blood. By the time the staircase widened into a cavernous ossuary, my breath came out in frost feathers that hung in the air like tiny ghosts. The walls were rib cages turned inside out, femurs laid like harp strings, skulls stacked into amphitheaters facing downward. In the center, a spiral of dust glimmered, bone ground so fine it floated above the floor, refusing to settle. I knelt. The dust smelled of lullabies and lie. When I exhaled, the particles rearranged themselves into lines, curves, dots, musical notation written by a hand that had never been born. The counter-harmony, the song that unmakes the choir. My throat ached with recognition before my mind caught up. The first note tasted of spring rain on copper roofs. I sang it softly, a single syllable shaped like a bird. The dust flared white, and pain blossomed behind my eyes as though someone had poured molten years straight into my skull. My knees buckled. When I stood, the skin on my hands had thinned to rice paper. Veins mapped blue roads beneath. 1 decade, gone. The second note rose unbidden, a minor fall that smelled of libraries burning. My hair lightened from black to iron gray, strands drifting like ash. Another decade. The third and fourth notes came together, a discordant leap that tasted of every birthday candle I would never blow out. My spine compressed with audible pops, 40 years traded for 4 measures. My reflection in a polished skull showed a stranger. White hair to my waist, skin stretched translucent over cheekbones sharp enough to cut lullabies. The counter-harmony was incomplete. A single note hovered at the edge of silence, a hollow space shaped exactly like my name. I stretched my fingers toward that missing pitch. The choir's voice drifted down the staircase, swelling note by note, warm as spilled honey and twice as hungry. They were tuning themselves to my heartbeat. If I sang the final tone, the choir would unravel, but the price was the sound my mother made when she first held me, the syllable carved into every mirror I ever looked into. I would forget the taste of my own story. The dust pulsed, impatient. Give it away. The spiral hissed. Names are just cages for music trying to escape. Tears, or maybe melted years, slid down my parchment cheeks. I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. My name clung to my tongue like a burr made of memories. First snowfall, first heartbreak, first song. The choir's harmony grew louder, wrapping around my bones, promising to finish the lullaby, whether I joined or not. Then I felt it, a pressure against my sternum, as if the unsung note were pushing from the inside out. The spiral of dust began to collapse inward, forming a tiny whirlpool that glimmered with all the colors of morning. If I withheld the last sound, the choir would devour the counter-harmony, and everything I'd already paid would be wasted. 40 years for nothing. I tasted iron. Somewhere above, glass voices cracked with anticipation. I inhaled the scent of bone and old lullabies, preparing to let go of the word that had always been mine. My lips shaped the beginning of goodbye, and the vortex froze. Something else had entered the staircase. Not footsteps, not breath, just a silence deeper than the ossuary itself, a listening so absolute it had weight. The choir faltered mid-phrase, harmony wobbling like a cracked bell. I felt the hairs on my ancient neck lift one by one. Whatever came next didn't care about names or songs or the arithmetic of years. It only waited to see which of us would blink first, me, the choir, or the silence that had learned how to hold a grudge for 900 years. The silence that had learned how to hold a grudge for 900 years, pressed against my back like a winter coat stitched from absence itself. I didn't blink, I couldn't. The choir's final note hung in the ossuary's throat like a swallowed scream, vibrating between bone and breath, and for one impossible heartbeat, the world forgot how to end. Then the staircase exhaled. Not air, not wind, just release. The vortex dissolved into mist that tasted of old lullabies and copper pennies. I stepped forward, and the amphitheater's threshold opened like a mouth that had been waiting centuries to speak. They were already there, the forgotten. Hundreds, no, thousands of them, seated in curved rows that curved wrong, like someone had folded space and forgot to iron the creases. Translucent silhouettes wearing the echo of faces I almost recognized. A woman with my grandmother's chin, but no eyes. A man whose laugh lines were carved deep even though his mouth held no sound. They shimmered, not quite solid, like heat mirages wearing Sunday best. I felt my throat close. These weren't ghosts. Ghosts remember dying. These were erasures. People whose names history had lost, whose stories had been unstitched from the fabric of the world by the choir's 900-year song, and they were staring at me like I was the last page of a book they'd never finished reading. A child stepped from the front row. Couldn't have been older than 7 when whatever happened, happened. She wore a pinafore that flickered between calico and starlight, and her feet didn't quite touch the glass floor. In her translucent hands, she cradled something small and golden, a locket, ornate, humming like a trapped bee. When she opened it, light spilled out that tasted like honey and heartbreak. "This is the first sunrise," she whispered, voice papery as moth wings, before names, before the choir learned how to forget. "Take it. Finish the counter harmony so we can exist again." Her eyes, hollow but somehow still pleading, met mine. "Please, I want to remember my mother's name." I took the locket. The moment my fingers closed around it, the memory rushed into me, like swallowing liquid sunrise. Warmth exploded behind my ribs, painting the inside of my skull with colors that hadn't been named yet. I saw the world's first dawn breaking over oceans that didn't know they were oceans yet. I felt the joy of light discovering shadow, the first time warmth kissed cold stone. It tasted like hope, and it hurt like dying. Because with every drop of that memory, something else leaked out. The reason I'd come, my mother's face, the shape of my own name, all dissolving into the choir's counter-harmony that was building now, note by note, behind my teeth. They began to sing. Not the choir, never the choir. The forgotten, voices overlapping like layers of forgotten lullabies, creating harmony so beautiful it scraped raw places I didn't know were wounded. The counter-harmony responded from my throat without permission, a note that tasted like copper and forgiveness. The amphitheater vibrated. The volcanic glass walls began to weep tears of liquid starlight. I felt the child's hand slip into mine, solid now, warming like bread fresh from memory's oven. Around us, silhouettes gained weight, color, the terrible burden of existing again. A man wept tears that turned into butterflies. A woman laughed, and the sound painted frescoes across the ceiling that hadn't been there before. But with every note I gave them, I lost more of myself. My childhood home became a house I'd only read about. My father's voice turned to static. The locket grew heavier, pulling at my chest like a hook. I was becoming the song, and the song didn't need the singer. The counter harmony swelled toward its penultimate note, the one that would either save them all or unmake me completely. My knees buckled. The child squeezed my hand, warm now, solid, real, and whispered, "Almost there. Just one more." I opened my mouth to sing that final, terrible note. But instead of sound, something else emerged. A silence. Not the grudge-holding silence from the staircase. Something younger, sharper. A listening that hadn't learned patience yet. The Forgotten froze mid-transformation, half solid, half memory. The locket cracked, bleeding sunrise. And from the back of the amphitheater, where the seats curved into darkness so complete it felt like the edge of the world, something stepped forward. Not a silhouette, not a person, just absence wearing the shape of a question mark. It moved toward me, and every step erased the counter-harmony from the air like breath on glass. "You forgot," it whispered, voice like static between radio stations. "You forgot why you came, and now the song remembers." The child's hand slipped from mine, already fading. The locket fell, cracked open, spilling the last of the first sunrise across the glass like spilled yolk. I reached for her, for the note, for anything, but my fingers passed through memory and air. The absence smiled. Not cruel, just inevitable. And as the final, penultimate note dissolved into the space between heartbeats, I realized the terrible truth. The counter-harmony wasn't meant to save them. It was meant to make room for something else entirely. Something that had been waiting 900 years for the singer to forget why she was singing. Clears throat. Whatever stepped out of the darkness wasn't here for the forgotten. It was here for the space their absence would leave behind. And I had just given it the perfect invitation. The last thing I heard before the amphitheater folded in on itself like a closing eye was the sound of my own voice, singing a lullaby I no longer remembered learning. So I was still holding that impossible note when the floor beneath the salt crust began to swell, like a lung taking its first breath in centuries. I felt it lift me, not violently, more like the earth itself was offering a courteous hand. The amphitheater walls rippled outward, dissolving into black glass that drank every echo of the forgotten. And then, from the fissures, the choir rose. Their robes poured up first, no fabric, but liquid night, drawn into sleeves and hoods that dripped darkness the way wax drips from a dying candle. I smelled winter and iron and something sweeter, like bruised apples left too long in the cellar. Each figure was faceless, an obsidian mask polished so brightly I could see myself multiplied across every curve, but the reflection never stayed still. In one mask, I was a child, in another, I was ancient, and in the third, I was nothing at all, just a hollow outline stitched together by starlight. They stepped onto the salt as though it were a carpet laid out for royalty, and every footfall rang like a bell struck underwater. I tried to step back, but my heel met the lip of the amphitheater's new floor, a mirror now, silver and restless, liquid mercury that held my weight only because it chose to. The choir ranged themselves in a semicircle, and without a conductor's cue, they opened their mouths in perfect unison. The note that came out was the same one I'd been singing, but older, deeper, like a river that remembers being an ocean. And that's when I saw her, me, standing third from the left, younger, maybe 12, wearing the same green coat I lost the day my mother forgot my name. The child me's mouth moved, shaping words I could almost taste but couldn't recall. "Help me remember," I think she said, though the sound never left her throat. The mercury beneath us shimmered, and suddenly that childhood moment unfolded around me. The smell of cedar, the scrape of a violin bow, my mother humming a lullaby that wasn't hers. I tried to reach out, but the mirror floor tugged my hand downward, showing me a new reflection, one where I had never been born. The amphitheater was empty except for the choir, and their robes were woven from the absence of my laughter. I watched the scene rewrite itself again. Now I was always their conductor, robed in night, holding a baton of frozen starlight. My life flickered like a candle in wind, each version shorter, colder. The choir's single note swelled, and the salt crust answered by blooming into crystalline flowers that chimed when they opened. Every petal showed a different memory I'd misplaced, the color of my first betrayal, the weight of a promise I broke before I knew what promises were. It was beautiful and brutal, like being read your own diary by a stranger who loves you too much to lie. I felt the counter-harmony I'd sung earlier twist inside my ribs, no longer a rescue, but a key turning in a lock that had rusted for 9 centuries. The younger me stepped forward, breaking formation. Her mask cracked, and beneath it, there was no face, only the same endless note pouring out like light through shattered stained glass. She extended a hand, and I understood the invitation, not to join them exactly, more like to become the space where the song could finally finish itself. My pulse matched the rhythm of their breathing, and the mercury floor softened until it kissed the tops of my feet. I wanted to ask what would happen to the me that still had a mother somewhere, still spilled coffee on Tuesdays, still hummed when nervous. But the choir only tilted their heads, and the mirror answered for them. It showed the amphitheater folding inward again, this time into the shape of a throat. And there, suspended in the dark, was a single silver seed, the last unsung note of the song that started 900 years ago. The child me held it out, and I realized it was humming my lullaby backwards. The choir leaned closer, robes rustling like ravens settling for the night. The seed pulsed once, twice, matching the slow, deliberate cadence of my heart. I felt the edges of my name begin to soften, ready to slide off like water from glass. All I had to do was take the seed and swallow the sound I'd been running from since the first chapter. But before my fingers could close around it, the mirror floor cracked straight down the middle, and from the fracture rose a second voice, off-key, human, achingly familiar. It was my own, singing the counter-harmony again. Only this time, it sounded less like rescue and more like a question. And the choir, for the first time in 9 centuries, hesitated. The mirror floor kept spreading its jagged grin beneath my feet, and the second voice, my voice, older, brittle, cracked like a dropped teacup, kept climbing the scale one painful semitone at a time. I tasted iron where my teeth had clipped my tongue. The choir's 1,000-masked heads swiveled toward me in perfect glacial unison, as if they'd only now noticed the lone human daring to argue with 900 years of perfect pitch. Their robes fluttered without wind, black silk beating like the wings of startled ravens. I pulled the first note of the countersong from the hollow behind my ribs. It came out a rasp, a splintered whisper. Still, the amphitheater answered. The marble underfoot softened to candle wax, sagging in slow motion. I felt the audience of the forgotten lean forward on their invisible benches, breath held in throats that no longer technically needed air. Somewhere behind them a baby cried, one thin, impossible wail, and then hushed. The second note followed, steadier, threading through the choir's descending chromatic dirge like a silver needle through black wool. Every time I matched their pitch, they slid a hair lower, trying to drown me in undertow. My knees shook. I was 82, maybe 83. The years had become soup sometime after Chapter 4, and my lungs felt packed with wet ash. Still, I had one advantage they did not. I was willing to break. Third note. A low boom rolled through the benches as though the earth itself had been struck like a drum. The masks of the nearest choristers fissured, hairline cracks racing across porcelain cheeks, splitting the fixed smiles into crooked grins. One mask fell away entirely, revealing nothing underneath but a swirling absence that hurt to look at. I forced my gaze back to the score, etched in bone dust, hovering in front of me. It trembled like a mirage, each symbol dissolving the moment I sang it. Fourth note. My voice cracked like old leather, but the counter-harmony clung to the air, sticky, defiant. The walls of Hollowglass, those impossible walls that had witnessed every performance since the plague times, rippled outward in concentric rings, stone behaving like water disturbed by a skipped pebble. I tasted salt. The entire amphitheater was weeping. But the fifth note, That was where the trap waited. The score demanded a name, not any name, but mine, the one I'd traded away for passage through the mirror maze back in Chapter 6. I reached for it, fingers scrabbling inside my skull like a blind woman in an attic, and came back empty. Panic flared hot and sour. I tried humming The Shape of the Absence, but a hole cannot carry melody. That was when the dressing room version of me stepped out of thin air, fully crystallized, skin turned to living glass. She looked exactly as I had the day I first arrived, younger, hair still dark, eyes wide with the optimism of someone who believes endings are tidy things. She raised a transparent hand in greeting. No, not greeting. Farewell. I'm sorry, she seemed to say, though no sound emerged. Then she shattered. The explosion was silent, beautiful, horrifying. 1,000 shards burst outward, spinning in lazy spirals like snowflakes made of starlight. They caught the choir's black light and refracted it into colors that had no names. I stood rooted while the fragments drifted down, arranging themselves at my feet into the precise curves and angles of the word I'd lost. My name, written in splinters sharp enough to slice memory. I knelt, hands trembling, and read the shards aloud. The syllables tasted of winter apples and copper pennies. As the final consonant left my lips, the fifth note arrived. Not sung, but surrendered. It poured from me like breath held since birth. The choir staggered, harmonies colliding, rogues tangling. Their perfect 900-year chord warped, bent, began to unravel. I felt the transformation start in my toes. A chill, then a tingling, then the unmistakable sensation of matter reorganizing itself into something clearer, harder, more fragile. Glass climbed my ankles, my shins, the slow inevitability of frost on a window pane. It didn't hurt. It felt like remembering a lullaby you'd never actually heard. The choir's last intact mask slipped, revealing another void. This one spoke in a voice like wind through dead leaves. You will echo forever. I almost laughed, because that had always been the plan, just not theirs. My torso crystallized, ribs becoming prisms that scattered the amphitheater's torchlight into dancing rainbows across the ruined walls. Only my throat, my treacherous, stubborn throat, remained flesh long enough to let the countersong's final echo ring out. The sound ricocheted off the cracked stone, tripled, became a storm of pure vibration. The choir's robes shredded into black moths that burst upward, disintegrating before they reached the stars. The audience of the Forgotten Roses won, applauding with hands that passed through one another like mist. Then the ground beneath me folded, not down but sideways, as though the world had been a page and someone had just turned it. I toppled, arms still half glass, half skin. Before I could strike the marble, or whatever the floor had become, I heard a new sound threading through the fading counter-harmony. A single violin, out of tune, playing the first 3 notes of a melody I had not yet written. The last thing I saw before everything went white was my reflection in the largest shard, a woman caught mid-transformation, mouth open in a song that had no end. Somewhere in the distance, someone, maybe me, maybe not, whispered. Chapter 12 begins where the glass remembers breathing. I fell through the whiteness, and it tasted like nothing I could name, neither snow nor salt, nor the blank page of a diary no one dared open. The violin note that had threaded itself through my countersong snapped taut, a single hair of sound stretched between 2 eternities. Then, with a hush so absolute it had weight, it cut. No echo, no fade, just a hole punched in the universe the exact shape of a heartbeat skipping its cue. I hung there, half glass, half breath, wondering which would shatter first. Time did not slow. It simply forgot to pass. In that forgetting, I felt my pulse stall, a drummer too stunned to strike. And because silence is never truly empty, something stepped into it. A child stood on nothing, barefoot, the soles of her small feet glowing like moonlit frost. She could not have been older than 9, hair the same ragged black as mine had been before age streaked it with the gray of unslept nights. In her right hand she held a tuning fork that looked carved from living obsidian, its twin prongs thrumming with a color I could hear more than see. When she raised it, the air around her shimmered, and I realized the fork was beating in rhythm with my own arrested heart. Hello, Alter me. Her voice was wind through cathedral ruins, soft yet carrying every stone's memory. I tasted salt and understood it was my tears, crystallized mid-cheek. I tried to speak, but sound had been evicted. Instead, thought poured out like ink and water. Who are you? Why this shape? She tilted her head, listening to words I had not spoken aloud. I am the first note you ever sang, before you knew mouths were for anything but screaming into the dark. The choir keeps me safe. Without us, the silence beyond would swallow every star you ever wished on. The whiteness around us curdled into shapes, fragments of streets I'd walked, faces I'd lost, melodies I'd hummed while waiting for buses that never came. Each shard vibrated to the fork's pulse, as if the world itself were a tuning chamber, and we the clumsy musicians. I reached instinctively for my violin, but my fingers met only the glass still creeping along my arms like frost on a window pane. It itched with unfinished business. The child stepped closer, the fork humming louder. You think the choir steals futures, she said, but it stitches them back together after the greater silence tears them out. Every forgotten name, every might have been, is a thread we knot into the song, so the tapestry doesn't unravel into nothing. I shook my head, or at least the idea of my head. But the people, those in Hollowglass, they're trapped, repeating the same sorrow. Their sorrow is the anchor, she replied, eyes reflecting galaxies collapsing and being born in the same instant. Without it, the void outside would rush in, hungrier than any grief you've known. Your counter-harmony is beautiful, older me. It would free them. It would also unmake everything else. A wind rose from nowhere, carrying the scent of old libraries and thunderstorm pavement. The glass along my skin flared, catching the child's light and throwing it back in fractured rainbows. I felt the countersong still inside me, a half-written lullaby aching to finish itself. One more stanza and the choir would fall silent. The forgotten would step out of their loops, and the universe would inhale a new, uncertain breath. But the child's tuning fork pressed against the hollow of my throat, gentle yet immovable, and I sensed the boundary it guarded, thin as vellum, sharp as violin wire. Choose, she whispered, and for the first time I heard fear in her voice, my voice, younger and braver and more terrified than I remembered being. Finish the song and break the choir, or let the choir finish its own and keep the dark outside your window. You cannot do both. I looked at her, at me, and saw the price of either answer etched into the glass crawling over my arms like vines. Somewhere, a violin string that had never been rosin began to vibrate in sympathy, calling me home to a choice that would cost the part of me still capable of music. My heart gave one reluctant thump, then waited. The child extended the fork. Its pulse matched the silence between my heartbeats, the exact length of a story not yet ended. I opened my mouth, not to sing, not yet, but to ask a question older than the choir itself, one whose answer might break the world or save it. The whiteness leaned in, listening. Whisper, what happens to the song if I choose neither? Yeah. What happens to the song if I choose neither? The child with the tuning fork didn't blink. She simply tilted her wrist, letting the silver tines catch the light that wasn't light, and the silence between my heartbeats stretched until it hummed like a bow drawn across glass. I felt the choir's 900-year weight pressing on my shoulders, felt the countersong's fracture bleeding starlight at my feet. Two melodies, both demanding my throat, my breath, my death. No, there had to be a third way. The amphitheater around us had begun to peel, stone flaking away like burnt paper. Each falling shard revealed nothing behind it, no sky, no earth, just the hungry absence that had eaten every erased soul before me. My younger selves flickered in that void, mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching not for salvation, but for the chance to warn me. They knew what I was about to attempt. I took one step toward the child. She couldn't have been more than 8, the age I was when the choir first tasted my dreams. The tuning fork vibrated faster now, matching the frantic rhythm of my pulse. I won't give you my name, I said, and my voice cracked like winter ice. But I will give you something better. The look on her face, shock, then dawning terror, told me I'd guessed right. She wasn't offering me a choice. She was the choice, a living sigil of the bargain that had trapped every cartographer before me. I pressed my palms together, feeling the counter-harmony burn against my left wrist, the choir's resonance freeze against my right. Both forces recoiled from each other, repelled by 9 centuries of mutual hatred. Perfect. I began to hum, not the choir's dirge, not the countersong's desperate scream, but the lullaby my mother sang when the harvest moon turned the fields silver. The child stumbled backward. The fork fell from her fingers, spinning end over end, and when it struck the dissolving stone, it rang out a note that had never existed before. A middle tone, a bridge. My own name rose from my throat, not as surrender, but as creation. The sound was terrible and beautiful, like rain falling upward. Every erased soul in the void turned toward me at once. They weren't screaming anymore. They were listening. The amphitheater folded. I don't mean it crumbled. I mean the geometry of it, bent inward. Centuries of stone compressing into a single point, no larger than a tear of pipisel. The counter-harmony and the choir shrieked in perfect unison, 2 snakes devouring each other's tails, and in their panic, they forgot to fight me. That was their mistake. My name, my true name, the one I'd never spoken aloud, poured from me like liquid starlight. It tasted of iron and honey, of the first frost and the last harvest. The child dissolved into silver dust, her mouth forming a single word of thanks before she became part of the new melody. And then they came, my younger selves, all of them, rushing toward me like swallows returning to a single chimney. The 5-year-old who first heard the choir singing through her bedroom wall, the 12-year-old who traced forbidden maps in stolen candlelight, the 19-year-old who'd tried to burn her own voice away with brandy and regret. They flowed into me, each restoration a small death and a larger birth. My hair darkened from gray to raven. The ache in my joints melted like spring snow, but when the last child self stepped into my chest, my eyes didn't return to brown. They stayed the color of the void between stars, pupils ringed with the same light that had devoured the amphitheater. I stood in the place where the amphitheater had been, which was no place at all, just a crossroads made of starlight and memory, stretching in directions that had no names. The new melody, my melody, settled around my shoulders like a cloak woven from every voice the choir had stolen. I could hear them still, the ones who had come after me, travelers lost between songs, drawn by the same promise that had nearly unmade me. Their footsteps echoed in the distance, not urgent yet, but getting closer. The cartographer's burden settled into my bones, with a weight that felt like coming home. Somewhere in the starfield, a new path flickered into being. It led away from the choir's lullaby, away from the countersong's scream, towards something that might be safety or might be a trap older than either. I took one step forward, then paused. Behind me, the silence was learning how to sing my name. I stepped onto the salt flats as the first pale thread of dawn stitched itself across the horizon, and the world breathed around me like it had just remembered how. My boots crunched on crystalline crust that sang under my weight. No, not sang. It whispered, a sound so soft I felt it more in my teeth than my ears, the way a lullaby lingers after you wake. The choir's note was gone, or so I told myself, yet every heartbeat carried its echo, a phantom harmony thrumming just beneath my ribs. The people I passed, salt gatherers with baskets slung low, a boy leading goats whose bells chimed like broken glass. They looked at me as if we had met before, but in a dream they could not quite grasp. The boy's eyes widened. I know you, he said, voice small. You were in my dream. You were crying salt. I touched my cheek, dry. Yet something inside me crystallized, sharp and bright. The moth wings in my palm, no longer wings now, but a compass of living light, quivered as though laughing at a joke only it understood. I knelt, dragging my finger through the salt. The grains clung to my skin like starlight made tangible. Each line I drew became a road, a promise, a lifeline for those who might follow. Cartographer no longer of mountains and rivers, but of possibilities. The first path curved east, toward a village whose name had been erased from every map. The second spiraled south, a corkscrew into memory. With every mark, I felt the weight settle deeper, the burden of guiding travelers who did not yet know they were lost. Behind me, footsteps, not the ones I had feared, the choir's hollow disciples, but softer, hesitant, a woman wrapped in indigo, her face half hidden by a veil of woven night. She carried no basket, only a small jar sealed with wax. "You draw the roads," she said, "but do you know where they lead?" I wanted to say yes, to lie with the confidence of every false prophet. Instead, I shrugged. "They lead away from erasure. That is enough." She nodded, placed the jar beside my newest line. Inside, something shimmered. Memories, perhaps, or songs too small to be stolen. A gift, a toll. The compass pulsed warmer. I stood, brushing salt from my knees, and noticed how the horizon had shifted. Not physically, no. The flats remained endless. The quality of distance had changed. What had been far now felt near, and what had been close retreated like a tide. The woman's footprints behind her already fading, as if the salt itself regretted marking her passage. I walked west, following my own line. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the sky until it hurt to look up. Each step left a faint afterglow, a residue of light that clung to my shadow. Somewhere ahead, I knew, the choir waited, not as singers now, but as listeners. They had grown quiet, digesting the countersong I had fed them, savoring the taste of their own unraveling. They are learning my name from the inside out. At midday, I reached the place where my line ended. No road, no village, only a mirror of salt reflecting my own face back at me, older than I remembered, eyes rimmed with silver. The compass spun wildly, then stilled, pointing not north or south, downward, into the flats, into memory. I pressed my palm to the ground. Cold, too cold. Beneath the surface, something moved. Not the choir, not yet. Something older. The first cartographer, perhaps, who had drawn lines before salt existed. Or the first singer, whose note had birthed the choir and the countersong alike. I felt the footsteps again, closer now. Not one traveler, but many, the ones I had warned myself about, lost between melodies. They carried no maps, only hunger, and behind them, a sound like wings made of glass. The silence, learning to sing. I drew one last line, quick and jagged, a lightning bolt across the white. It pulsed once, then vanished, taking my shadow with it. When I looked up, the horizon had cracked open, a seam of black between earth and sky. Through it, I could see myself walking away. The footsteps stopped. A breath held across the flats, and then the seam whispered my name. Not the one I was born with, but the one the salt had given me, the one the choir would never know. I stepped forward. I never felt the step that carried me through the seam, yet my boots found gravel where the sky had been. The air tasted of iron and lullabies. Yes, lullabies. Like someone humming over a cradle made of starlight. I knew, without turning, that the tear had sealed behind me, knitting itself with threads of quiet so complete I could hear the blood moving in my ears. Years, they told me later, slid past like pages in a wind I no longer walked through. I did not count them. Age, like a name, had become a coat I could take off or put on at will, and tonight I wore it lightly. The child arrived at dusk, boots too big and courage too small. I felt the tremor of their footsteps before I saw them, one heartbeat tripping over the memory of mine. Ah! They carried a tin lantern whose flame kept trying to lie down and die, yet the child cupped it like a secret. They approached the husk of Hollowglass amphitheater, that broken bowl of night we once filled with impossible songs. Obsidian shards littered the sand, each edge singing its own thin note when the wind slid across it. The child paused at the lip of the ruin, drew a breath that shook, and spoke my old name, not the one the salt gave me, but the one I carved into silence when the choir first turned its thousand throats toward my soul. I almost answered. Almost. Instead, I stayed hidden behind the rib of a fallen column, watching. The child knelt, brushed sand from a black wall, and traced the lines I etched with a fingernail made of moonlight. My final map, spirals within spirals, rivers of pitch, and at the bottom, the warning. Their fingertips stopped on the last sentence. If you hear the choir, sing your name before they finish. I wondered if they would dare. Children often do, when the dark asks politely. A hush gathered, thick as velvet. Somewhere beneath the sand, a single string tightened. The child must have felt it too, because they straightened, shoulders square, and opened their mouth. What came out was not a word, but a warble, half bird, half broken bell. Sweet, terrible bravery. The obsidian answered. A low thrum rose through the soles of their boots, climbed the bones, and spilled out the throat of the world. I heard the echo of my counter melody, yes. The same one I used to knock the choir's throats shut, only softer now, gentled by distance and mercy. The child's voice wobbled, steadied, then wrapped itself around that echo like a scarf around winter. Together, they made a new chord, neither requiem nor dirge, but something that rocked the heart like a cradle. I stepped forward at last, mothwing compass folded tight in my palm. The child did not startle. Perhaps they had sensed me all along. Their eyes, wide, dark, and older than their face, found mine across the gloom. You left this, they said, tapping the wall. Why? I considered lying, offering some grand tale of sacrifice and stars. Instead, I told the smallest truth. Because the song needed another throat someday. The child nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Children again. Together, we listened. The echo circled us, braiding our heartbeats into one slow drum. I felt the choir stir far below, a great beast rolling over in its sleep. But it did not wake. My counter-melody held, soft as silk, strong as grief. The child began to sway, humming under their breath, and I joined, not with the salt name or the glass name, but the newest one, the one that fits between lullaby and dawn. My voice cracked. Theirs soared. Between us, we patched the tear I once ripped across the sky. When the last note faded, the child looked up. Will they come back? I shrugged, the way ageless people do when tomorrow feels like yesterday's coat pocket. Perhaps. Perhaps they already did, and we sang them gentle. The lantern flame steadied, throwing gold across the shattered columns. Somewhere, a night bird called twice, then fell silent, satisfied. I opened the mothwing compass. The needle spun, not north or south, but toward the child's chest, where the new song nested warm and alive. I snapped it shut. The needle stayed. We walked out together, boots crunching over crystal and memory. Behind us, the obsidian walls dimmed to ordinary stone, their secret spent, their promise kept. I did not look back. I never do. The child hummed the new tune, and I listened the way old soldiers listen to rain, grateful, astonished, at peace. At the edge of the ruins, they stopped, turned, and asked the question I'd waited centuries to hear. What happens after the song ends? I knelt, placed the mothwing compass in their hand, and folded their fingers over it. It never ends. It only hands the melody to the next throat. We parted beneath a sky washed clean of cracks. I walked on, ageless, coat lighter by one pocket. Somewhere behind me, a child sang my name, the way morning sings dew off grass. I smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since the choir first opened its mouths. The note lingered, no longer a requiem, but a lullaby rocking the dark to sleep. I lifted my voice, just once, to join it. The echo answered, soft as a promise, and carried me forward into the hush that remembers everything, yet forgives it all.